Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. The Pharmacy Leaders Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, with interviews and advice on building your professional network, brand, and a purposeful second income from students, residents, and innovative professionals.
Let's do this.
Okay. All right, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast. Today I have Joanna Penn on, who is a thriller author, but also writes quite a bit of nonfiction. And she's moved into writing a couple of courses that I think will help us quite a bit with especially productivity and opening up the time to start writing. And I know many of you are looking at your exit loans and kind of looking at the monthly payments that you'll be making. And it's just always nice to have an extra income. And being an author is one great way to be able to do that remotely. So, Joanna, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on, Tony.
Okay, well, let's just get started with just a little bit of your background and specifically to nonfiction. I know you have JF Penn, which is fiction, and Joanna Penn, that is nonfiction. But how did you get to teaching? You've got a degree from Oxford in theology, and how did that kind of come about?
Well, I mean, as ever, I'm in my mid-40s, so we all have a long career. But I was, after Oxford, I went into management consulting. I spent 13 years working in corporates, large corporates, doing financial stuff. So I've had my corporate career, but it was never satisfying to me. I always felt like there was something missing. I felt like I was working a day job to earn money, and it was just all going down the drain. It was just pointless. So I started writing. Like, when I looked at the lifestyle I wanted a scalable income. I like earning a good living, as I'm sure everybody listening does as well. So I was looking for a type of business where I could live the lifestyle I wanted. I'm an introvert. I like being on my own. So writing seemed like a good idea. So I started a blog and a podcast back in 2008 now, a while ago. And that grew into then writing books. And that's basically what I've done now for the last 10 years. I left my job in 2011. And basically, my business now is I have my nonfiction site, The Creative Penn, with a double N, and a podcast, The Creative Penn Podcast, and also my fiction. And I also have a second podcast and site, booksandtravel.page, which is very much looking towards the travel memoir side of things. So I really believe that writing can be part of your career, whatever you're in. So, pharmacy is a great example. You can make it a scalable form of income that adds and fits in with the rest of your life.
Awesome. Well, let's make sure to talk about the other podcast at the end of these questions, because I also want to talk a little bit about that, because I think memoir is actually maybe one of the more accessible ways to enter into being an author and just kind of getting your feet wet. But let's first talk about, you have a lot of followers, and at first maybe people asked for your help and you said, oh, sure, I can help you. But now you have some tens of thousands of followers. How do you help that many with their productivity? So if you could talk a little bit about how you kind of came to the course and deciding to actually put video to paper, as it were, and kind of get the Productivity for Authors course off the ground.
Yeah, sure. So as you say, the one-to-many approach, and also a global business, I think this is really important. I knew I wanted a scalable business where my time was not connected with the amount of money I could make. So I wanted to create intellectual property that would earn me money over and over again. So books are one thing, courses are another. And nowadays it's much easier to do this stuff technically. I use a service called teachable.com and highly recommend them if people want to do courses. And the great thing about doing an evergreen course, which means it's open all the time, anyone can join, is that people kind of randomly join whenever they hear about it. So that just means it's available there. So I can spend the time once creating the course and it will help people over and over again. So this is a big tip for people. If you do want to do a course, make sure it is evergreen as much as possible rather than time specific, because that will mean you have to keep re-recording it over and over again.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah.
So like an evergreen tree, and then evergreen content as well. So something that's going to kind of last through the ages. So rather than something that's, maybe happening right now, it's kind of you pick a course based on the principles of something that's going to continue to be an issue. So productivity, time management, it's always going to be an issue.
Oh yeah, and for example, I do have a video in there about the tools that I use, but it's not a how to use that tool, because
Okay.
even though something like Evernote has been around for a long time, they keep changing the functionality. So I think any kind of technical, videos can really date quite quickly because people change their stuff all the time.
Sure. Well, let's talk about something that you talked about actually last time in our podcast, which was as soon as you finally made the jump to full-time entrepreneur, you were there at your home, and that lasted not too long until you said, I have to go somewhere. And that you had to go to the coffee shop or you had to go somewhere to get work done. Can you talk first about the time and place for writing as it relates to the course?
Yeah, sure. So I think, and it's funny because I have that now. I've just moved house, but I still have the same thing. We are creatures of habit. If we're in a specific place, we do certain things. We eat a certain food,
Sure.
or we behave a certain way, or when we're with different people, we do different things. So if you want to do something like creative writing, whether that's nonfiction or fiction or whatever you want to do that's different, that is creative, you can't do that in the same place that perhaps you do other things. So I'm talking to you at a desk that I never write fiction at. I just can't. I go to a cafe where I do my first draft writing for my fiction and nonfiction, because my creative brain needs to be primed for something else rather than here. I'm like, yeah, I might do my accounts. 1 minute I might talk to you about marketing. Another minute, I'm dealing with businessy stuff. So that's one really important thing for people. Now, I would say though, if people listening are, like you say, working as pharmacists, and many people have written their first books while at work. So what I would suggest there is you kind of hack it a bit. And if John Grisham, famous legal thriller author, wrote his first novel while in his legal firm, but he would go out to his car and write on a pad, a yellow pad.
I didn't know
and
that.
so maybe if you want to write down ideas at work, maybe you have a different notebook in your pocket that you don't use for anything else. It's kind of just a brain hack of how do you tell your creative self that you're taking this seriously and that it's not just mishmashed up with all the rest of the to-do list that we all have in daily life.
Sure. So now you've got a number of ideas, maybe that you've done at work or that you've done in your car. Can you talk a little bit about technology? You mentioned dictation as one of the ways to do it, but some of the technology tools that can allow you to get the words down and maybe transcribed rather than sitting at a desk, hoping the words come in the right order, organizing, things like that.
Yeah, sure. So dictation is brilliant, especially if you commute in a car on your own. And I mean, lots of people sit in traffic when some people are. I don't know whether it's legal to actually dictate while you're moving, but if there are ways that you can dictate on the move. I've certainly done it walking. So if you want to combine some health with dictation, I use a little handheld Sony device, but there are lots of apps on the phone. Dragon Anywhere is one example. And you don't have to dictate finished prose. I think that's really important. You don't have to come out with a perfect sentence and then dictate it. You can use it for ideas. You can use it for starting to get your creative juices flowing as such, some notes or whatever. And then over time, you might turn that into much more. I certainly combine dictation with a sort of a typing approach. Another tool, if you are writing a book or a dissertation or a big project, I even do it for blog posts and things. I use Scrivener, which is fantastic software, really good for organizing longer works. Maybe some of the listeners do medical journals or other things like that. So that really helps me as well. I think just coming back to productivity as well, my biggest tip, if you want to do a book project, is to time block. So not every morning, but I have time blocks for my JF Penn brand, so my fiction brand. I actually set aside time in my calendar for that brand. And then this meeting with you, for example, is another block in my calendar. So by time blocking, and I'll plan my time blocks, months in advance, I make sure that I achieve the goals I have set for each of my brands.
What about energy. I know this wasn't on the list of questions, but I know that many of them come home from a 12-hour day, and there's just kind of an energy drain. When you've kind of burnt out, sometimes introverts, when they spend too much time with extroverts or too much time at a meeting, their energy actually goes down quite quickly. How do you recharge maybe after a long day if that's your only time to write, if you can't write in the morning?
Yes. So I spent 5 years building up my business, and I wrote my first 3 books while doing a job where I worked in a open plan office with 400 people.
Oh my gosh.
So I totally get this. And I used to wonder why I would get such bad migraines, which disappeared when I left that environment. Well, you said if people can't write in the morning, but I'm going to challenge that, because I found that you're completely right. If you go to work and you spend 9, 10, 11, 12 hours plus commute, whatever, in someone else's workplace doing a job that you're paid to do, if you come home, you don't have the energy left. You just don't. So I used to get up at 5 and write before work. So I would do 30 to 45 minutes before going to work. And then often I would, on my commute, I would listen to podcasts like this, and I'd get ideas and things. And in the evening, I would then, maybe do some marketing stuff, or start building a website, or start learning the things that you need to learn if you want to do this kind of career. There's things you have to learn that are not just the craft. So that would be my tip. It really is, again, it's about time blocking and what you're willing to give up. And you can't give up that job at the beginning, so you have to give up something. So I would go to bed earlier and get up earlier. And maybe you have kids as well as a job. It's tough. I feel for you. But you just have to do that. Another little hack, if you can, I know there's a lot of pharmacists listening, but if you can work from home sometime, then I used to have 2 laptops going, one with things I had to do for my job, and the other one with stuff I was doing for building the business. And of course, if you can work from home, that commuting time, that any time, extra time you need to spend on that business. And probably my biggest tip here is you have to decide what you want, and then you have to decide what you're going to do to get that. None of us have any more time than the other person. We all work on priorities. So you have to find that time from somewhere. For example, back then, and this was easier because when I did this, it was before Netflix, but we got rid of the TV for a couple of years. So another hack might be reduce your TV by an hour a night or something like that. But there are ways that you can find the time.
Sure. Well, let's talk about one last point, which was you wrote a book, The Healthy Writer, and I wanted to talk a little bit about healthy productivity, but maybe it was in a podcast, maybe it was in that book, but I could have sworn that you had said that writing, or someone had said that writing had made you healthier because you had gotten all those things that were in your brain onto the page about something that was bothering them. Can you talk a little bit about how writing is actually something that's maybe cathartic or healthy?
Oh, yeah. I do say that all the time. In fact, I say that about my fiction. People are like, oh, how come you're so jolly and happy and your books are so dark? Like, I write some quite darker crime books and thrillers. Yeah. And it really is true. Like, the darker people write, the more psychologically healthy they are, because you just put all your angst onto the page. And if you write romance and happy things, you might find yourself needing another outlet. So, yeah, absolutely there. But yeah, writing certainly psychologically healthy to write whatever. So maybe it's a goal about your life. Writing down goals can really help you achieve them, or keeping journals. I've got nearly 40 journals sitting here behind me that I've written over the years. When I got divorced, sort of whenever it was, 13, 14 years ago, I wrote sort of 2 whole journals in a month or 2, and that person doesn't exist anymore. The person who wrote that still exists in those journals, but I got it all out of me. So sometimes you can heal yourself through writing and then potentially heal other people. And in fact, my nonfiction books, I write what I need to learn and hope it helps other people. So the Successful Author Mindset has just a ton of my own angst in.
Okay. All right. Yeah, and I did the math. It would cost about 21, if you sold 21 books on Amazon at $9.99, then that would be that would actually pay for the course. So it wouldn't take many sales. But can you talk one last thing about going wide versus Amazon? Because Amazon makes things easier, or their Kindle platform, but that there's a wide world out there. I talked to, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Rakuten Kobo, and I put my books on there, and I've just started to get sales. I've just started to get some sales in Canada. So can you talk about how you don't have to limit yourself to your own country?
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you asked this, because I think the whole phrase sort of publishing wide means that you're not exclusive to Amazon. So, we love Amazon. They're an amazing company. They do very well for authors, but they don't own the world. And I actually have a world map here in front of me. I'm in Bath, UK, as we talk. And Kobo, as you mentioned, one of the lovely things on their dashboard is a world map with where people have bought your books. And I've sold books in 86 countries through Kobo, which is crazy, like people in Namibia,
Wow.
in Africa, for example. I mean, it's crazy. And in fact, podcasting, people in 215 countries have listened to my podcast. So when you think about it, how can people in all these other countries where Amazon either does not have a presence at all, or is not allowed because they are, American, and some countries have an issue with American companies, where if we're thinking about a business, and this is the thing, I have a very long-term mindset about my career as a writer. If I want to sell everywhere for the rest of my life and 50 plus years after I die, I want my work to be everywhere. And this is the other thing, you might help someone the other side of the world with your work. So and I make money from all these different places too. So wide is a mindset. The technical side, sure, takes a bit of setting up, but it can be done. I'm sure you'll put a link in the show notes or something to, I have a free ebook called Successful Self-Publishing, which explains all of that. So people can go check that out if they actually want to know how. But I think that mindset shift is the biggest thing. It's okay, I want my words to reach the world. And if someone finds me somehow on the internet, I want them to be able to buy my book.
Okay. Well, you're very intentional about, I know authors are very intentional about titles, and certainly with the next course, you're just as intentional, how to write nonfiction, turn your knowledge into words. And can you talk first about the mindset shift? Because you don't talk about, until module 3, you don't even talk about writing. You talk about, you're like, before we even get there, let's work on our mindset, let's work on planning, then we'll put pen to paper. And I think that's so important because, every battle is won and lost before it's ever fought type of thing. Can you start with talking about mindset a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I think this book was actually really hard to write. I thought I was just going to write how to write nonfiction, just, bash it out there. And then when I started to get into it, I realized that I do not want any more books in the world that are just, phoned in. And we know, you go to the bookstore, you go on Amazon, you'll see a ton of books that don't seem to be personal enough to help anyone.
Sure.
So what I wanted to do was kind of frame writing nonfiction. This is really important. Writing nonfiction can help you. It can help other people. It can change your life. It can change other people's lives. So the mindset side is very much getting over some of the fears that might get in your way. So one of the biggest thing with nonfiction writers is I'm not an expert in this, or even, and I've heard this from people who have 20 years experience in a niche, and they'll say I'm not an expert. And it's like, look, I'm not who's to say I'm an expert or whatever on writing nonfiction, but this book and this course is my opinion and my experience. So that's what I want you to think when it comes to approaching any kind of writing. People want to connect. That is so important in the environment we live in now, which is so technological, over the top. We want to connect with people. So put yourself, your personal stories, and your fear. You can put your fear in there. I mean, I talk about my fear of judgment. I I still have fear of judgment. I want you to like me. I want you to like my books. What if you don't, And of course, that fear of judgment, fear of, the self-doubt. I'm a terrible writer. I mean, we can fix all of these things, but you can't necessarily get rid of those fears or those concerns. But if you know that they are normal, then you can move on.
Okay. Yeah, I am terrible at releasing a book, and then I'm right on my dashboard hoping someone's going to buy it, in the first 5 minutes to validate the book. I don't know. I just got to stop that. I've got to stop.
Well, and well, for you, the mindset shift is a long-term mindset.
Right.
I don't even check this stuff. I check my book sales once a year at tax time, which is now for me, because I've got a long-term view, which is I want my books to be around for a long time. And most books, that you control, if you're independent, you control the rights. They do sell over time. You're never going to get that week one spike, so don't worry about it.
Okay. Well, let's talk about planning a little bit. How do you, from the course, how do you start planning for the book? What does that really mean to plan a book?
Well, first of all, I guess planning your time is really important. So again, time blocking, as I mentioned, whatever it's going to take you. So just do the calculations. If you can write 500 words, in an hour, or 1,000 words in an hour, how long will it take you to write a first draft? And you can just start with that. I mean, I like to set deadlines. I think they really help. So a normal nonfiction book might be around 50 to 60,000 words. So that might be 50 to 60,000 hours. So maybe that'll take you 3 months or 6 months or something. Schedule those hours. So that's one thing, is planning your time. And always plan more time, because everything takes longer than you think.
That's for sure.
Yeah, but then planning the book itself, this can be quite, or it can go top down or bottom up for nonfiction. So the first one is this book, the book and the course are a good example of top down, which is I'm going to write a book and a course on how to write nonfiction. I'm just going to do that. And then I create a table of contents, and then I put the material together, and then I get it out there. And I got this course out the same time as the book, the same time as the audiobook, the same time as everything. I was very well organized with that book. But then that's one way. Another way is to kind of let it bubble up from your audience. So, for example, pharmacy, what are the top 10 questions that you get asked in the pharmacy? Maybe that you could turn that into a book. So you're planning your material. The other thing I've discovered with nonfiction, so the Successful Author Mindset book was never meant to be its own book. It was a part of a different book. And then I realized that it was turning into a much bigger animal. So I would suggest that will come up for you. If you're writing nonfiction, you might look at what you've got, the material that you've got, the knowledge you've got, and you might decide to split off some of it into something else. So those are some of the things that you'll find in the planning phase that will help you structure the book before you do the actual writing. Or, just to be clear, you can just write stuff and organize it later.
Sure. With Scrivener or something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Module 3 has perfectionism in it. And as pharmacists, obviously, we want to strive to be perfect in making sure the right medication goes to the right patient with the right instructions. But I know that there are many different ways to write. My way to write is to actually usually record and then edit. But I've heard over and over again, just get the book done and then get it edited. But so many people will do a paragraph and then tweak the paragraph and then next paragraph, but then start going back to the first paragraph. Can you talk a little bit about overcoming perfectionism?
Oh, yeah, sure. And well, one thing we've got to realize is, if you get the wrong dose for the wrong patient, you could kill someone or make them very sick. So, sure, get that right. Yeah. But this is writing. And there is no correct answer. I mean, there are obviously rules for grammar and all of that, but how you write, your voice is going to be different to my voice if we wrote on the same topic. So yeah, that perfectionism can hold you back. And the question I always ask about perfectionism is, what is it hiding? So is it actually, do you actually have a fear of judgment, for example? So there are ways to get around that. So if you really feel like your writing isn't good enough, well, first of all, if you do get the book down, you need to self-edit it. So for example, this morning I spent a couple of hours self-editing my next novel, and I self-edit a number of rounds before it goes to my editor. So once you've self-edited, reorganized, edited again, done some rewriting,
Sure.
then you can hire an editor to then help you. So you get to the perfectionism later, but just to acknowledge also, you will probably never pick up a book and not find at least one typo in it or an error somewhere. People are human, so you don't need to worry about that. But definitely hiring professionals can really help. But I'm of the type who writes the first draft completely. Then I print out the whole book. So I've been editing this morning on a printout, and then I type my changes back into Scrivener. So that's the other thing. I said it earlier. You don't write a perfect sentence first time. You get it down and you shape it later, especially with nonfiction, actually, because often you will restructure the book much later on.
Okay. Well, something that I've always run into, which is in nonfiction, which doesn't really happen as much in fiction. In fiction, which book precedes the next book. There's often sometimes a number, such and such in the series. But what order would you have someone read your books about writing? So you have How to Make a Living with Your Writing, The Successful Author Mindset, How to Write Nonfiction. Which one comes first? Maybe which one's second?
Well, I have 10 books for writers.
I just went with 3. I just started with 3.
And more to come. Basically with nonfiction, the tip is, what is your problem? Then go find a book on that.
It's a very New York thing to say. What's your problem? What's your problem?
But that would be my point for anyone. If you, like, for example, we mentioned successful self-publishing, you would only look at that book if you were getting to the point where you wanted to publish. So, and if you want to write, then How to Write Nonfiction, for example. So that's what I would suggest. I can't say, or, How to Make a Living with Your Writing, for example, it's one of my top selling books, but maybe someone listening is really happy in their pharmacy career, and doesn't want to make a living with their writing. Maybe they just want to write a book. So that would be my answer. And this is also a tip. If you do want to write a book or make a course, always think, what is the problem? What is the customer's problem? What is the reader's problem? And that is a way to title your book or your course, because that will it helps them identify what they're looking for.
So would you put, for example, would you say your problem or the problem? So I'm not trying to be grammatical, but I'm just saying when somebody reads it, it's my problem and how to solve my problem. How do you decide on tense and grammar? I know this is kind of getting into the weeds.
No, it's fantastic. Well, I think it would just depend. I mean, obviously,
so you're writing, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you'll see that a lot. I mean, the principles of copywriting for headlines, blog posts. I mean, you only have to go look at a whole load of tabloid magazines, or newspapers, or go to BuzzFeed,
Okay. Yeah.
And you'll get some good ideas, or go on Amazon and look at the top best-selling books. But I tend to go with because I'm in the self-help writing niche for Joanna Penn. I often use a sort of how-to principle, how to market a book, how to write nonfiction, etc. But obviously with other books, so when I write a memoir, which I have started, it will be very different. And technically that's nonfiction or narrative nonfiction. So there's no rules, but the reader has to see themselves in your title. They have to know that they want that book. So, I'm trying to think of a pharmacy example. I can't really think of one because it's not really my niche, but be specific, or even be specific about audience. So let's just do diet, for example. I've got an example in the course, how to cook easy gluten-free dinners for kids in 15 minutes. That is a very specific, very specific title, and maybe you have lots of smaller books like that, but that is very clear on who that's for. And it's better to be specific than go with something very, very wide, because your target market won't know what it is. So we're kind of moving into marketing there.
Right. Well, you have a book on that. You have a book on that. Okay. Well, no, and it's just the Google search would end up being how to cook a gluten-free meal for my children, but then the title of the book would probably be how to cook a gluten-free meal for your children, because people don't want to read about your children. So anyway, it just becomes this kind of, grammatical trap. So that's kind of fun. But tell me about this new podcast. Tell me about the memoirs and the travel. You've already got so much going on. I can't imagine taking on a second podcast. It's like getting another bank account where you have to go to, or another section. But tell me about the new podcast and how people can get to it, and what's it all about.
Yeah, sure. So I hit 10 years in my business, which is, one of those moments you start looking at your life. And, I've written a lot. I've written, 28 books by now. And I was ready for another challenge. I really was. And I'm not turning off any of the other stuff. I still do the Creative Penn podcast every week. But I wanted to start looking at some of the stuff behind my fiction. So my thrillers and my dark fantasy books, they're all based on my travels. So I've traveled a lot, lived a lot of places around the world, and when I write my thrillers, they're about the places I've traveled to. So I wanted to start using my research in my marketing in a way. And also, I really love podcasting, so I get to interview people about books and travel. So it's at booksandtravel.page, or you can just search Books and Travel on your podcast app. And I also have my own solo episodes, which are going really well. So I just did one on scuba diving, for example, and I've got one coming up on Oxford, because as we mentioned, I went to Oxford. Yeah, so I just finding it's a different way of expressing myself. But because I have a lot of knowledge about how to turn content into income, I know I can make this into another viable business. So it's partly because I just love talking about travel, and it's partly because I know I can turn it into something else. And that kind of comes back to what we talked about at the beginning about scalable income. Once you have your processes and your systems and your productivity in place, you find you have more time.
Yeah.
More time to create. So I'm writing more books, doing more podcasting, and that's what I love to do. That's how I enjoy doing my life, basically.
So with this new podcast, though, are you taking video? Are you taking pictures? Is your research more than just the writing or looking it up? How are you kind of taking advantage of the medium that you're going to be in a different place? Or are you podcasting in just audio? I know you have a YouTube channel, all those things.
Yeah, so with Books and Travel, I'm focusing on audio and images. So you're right. For every podcast, and also I'm doing articles. So I just did one on 13 places to visit in New Zealand. I lived in New Zealand for 7 years. I've written about New Zealand, but that includes some of my pictures from living in New Zealand. And I'm actually going back to Oxford this weekend to take some pictures for that episode. So this is another key. You can't do everything. And I've decided to go with audio plus images for that brand. I do have a YouTube channel for my brand, The Creative Penn. So very much choosing the things that you want to do is super important. And that again comes back to productivity, because half of it is saying no to things. So I'm trying to be super careful with this one, not to kill myself with work. So I have more time for reading books and traveling.
Okay. And it sounds like you've got a both and. You're both going to the site to go check it out, but then it also might turn into another book again. So it sounds like you got it all together.
And remember, for something to be tax deductible, you have to make revenue from it. So I always write books about the places I go to.
So smart, so smart.
This is a great career.
Well, I've asked you a number of questions. Do you have anything you want to add before we sign off? And then we'll ask how the best place is where listeners can reach you and get that free book.
Yeah, sure. So I would just really encourage you, the listener, to just try some writing. Maybe you're annoyed with yourself because it's something you've always wanted to do. And I would just challenge you to start writing, whatever that is. If it's a journal, if it's a book you've always wanted to write, if it's a memoir, if it's a helpful book that you can use to grow your business or grow your personal brand, there is no excuse in this world. You can make the time and you can get that book out there. So I really hope you do.
Okay. And then what is the best way for a listener to reach you on your nonfiction side?
Yeah, so go to thecreativepenn.com, pen with a double N, and you can get the free author blueprint there. You can just sign up for that and also listen to the podcast, the Creative Penn podcast, if you're interested in writing. If you have a question, then tweet me at the Creative Penn with a double N. That's always the best way to get me. And of course, if you enjoy traveling, check out Books and Travel.
Okay, Joanna, thanks so much for being on the Pharmacy Leaders podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Tony.
Support for this episode comes from the audiobook Memorizing Pharmacology, a relaxed approach. With over 9,000 sales in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, it's the go-to resource to ease the pharmacology challenge. Available on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon.com, in print, ebook, and audiobook. Thank you for listening to the Pharmacy Leaders podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. Be sure to share the show with the hashtag #PharmacyLeaders.